The city needs more priests and the world needs more priests. This was a concern they had at the time of Jesus and before. As we heard in the second reading today from the letter to the Hebrews about the role of the Jewish priests. There were many Jewish priests. During the week of Passover, about 1 million people, we're told by scholars, descended upon the city of Jerusalem. And about 25,000 individual sacrifices of lambs, of grain, of pigeons and other things were offered in sacrifice during just 1 week. 25,000 in the city of Jerusalem. And all of those were offered by priests. So they needed many, many priests. Imagine how many priests you would need to do 25,000 sacrifices just in 1 week. And then the clean-up that would go with it. And I sort of imagine it almost a bit like a bad Halloween party. You've got this smoke going up all over the place. Imagine the smoke of 25,000 lambs being burnt and grain and other things. It's a pretty graphic sort of image when you start to think about it. The Jewish understanding, up until the time of Jesus, was the role of the priest. The priest was the one who was meant to be holy. He offered this sacrifice, and that would then make everybody else holy. Everyone just had to bring their little offering, their sacrifice, and the priest was the one who made them holy. And they had to do this over and over and over again. We're told the high priest would do this, or the priests would do this in the temple every single day. It's a pretty repetitive method in one sense, you think. Jesus comes and he becomes the high priest, and he offers one sacrifice that is also an eternal sacrifice. We don't keep offering it over and over again. But what we do when we do come to Mass is that we participate in a mystical way, a mysterious way, in that one sacrifice of Jesus. A lamb isn't being brought and placed onto this altar and we're going to offer it in sacrifice. I haven't been trained as a butcher of lambs. I haven't been trained to work out how we're meant to burn grain so it creates some great fire or great smoke. What we are doing is we're taking a step into the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. This is what happens every time we come to Mass. We become mysteriously, mystically present at the Last Supper, at Calvary, with Jesus on the cross and at the resurrection. We are there as part of that. One of the things I found really interesting last year when we started live streaming during lockdown is that I would go online after I'd seen that we'd have our Mass and everything was sort of working with the live streaming. And there would be live streamed Masses going on around the world every hour of the day on a Sunday. And probably it's still the case now. And that any time of the day, especially on a Sunday, there are people right throughout the world who are participating in this one sacrifice of Jesus. It's not a new sacrifice, but it is an eternal sacrifice. We don't make it a new one today. It's the same sacrifice that Jesus offered. We don't need new priests. Interestingly, the early church community, the book of Hebrews that we hear, which we heard from today, and some of the other books of the New Testament, don't refer to people like myself as priests. They refer to them as presbyters. The priests were what the Jewish people were, the ones who offered this sacrifice over and over again. And they were the ones who were meant to be the holy people. And everybody else wasn't so holy. What happens as Christians is that we become conformed to Christ. We become Christ through baptism, through christening, is to become anointed in Jesus Christ. And so we understand through baptism, all of us are priestly. All of us participate in the work of sacrifice that is Jesus Christ. We're all called to be holy. I'm not just the one who's been called to be holy. All of us are called to be holy because we're all called to be Christ. We've all become Christ. We've put on Christ through baptism. And so we're called to live out that way of Christ. We don't make a new sacrifice every time we come to church. I don't make a new sacrifice every time I come to the altar. But we're participating in that one holy sacrifice that is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But we're called to respond. And because we are called to respond, the gospel asks us to love God with everything that we have. Often it's popular in our world to love others, to love our neighbour, to love the environment and other things. To love our neighbours, that's a good thing. But we also need to love God with everything that we have. To think about, what's God wanting me to do today? What is God's will for the world today? How can I bring the love of God to our world? How can I experience and respond to that love of God? And that's the challenge. How do we love God with all that we are? All our mind, strength, our soul, our being. How can we love our neighbour as we love ourselves? I often think about this passage, this gospel, in three ways. We're called to love God. We're called to love neighbour. But before we can do that, we need to recognise that God is in us. We need to love God in ourselves. It sounds a bit self-centred at times, but if you recognise that we are created in God's image and likeness, then God's in us. And we need to love the things of God that's in us. Recognise that and then see that in our neighbours, those around us, and say, yes, I can see that in you as well. And then help to allow that to thrive, to glow out into the world. And together, as we're doing right now, we gather, we reflect on the scriptures, and we love our God. Last week I wasn't here at the 8 a.m. Mass to talk about it, but I talked about how God becomes present in different ways when we gather. God's present here in the people, the gathering of the people. It's such a great thing to be able to gather together. God's present when we read the scriptures and we break open the word, and God's present here on the altar. The church also teaches that God becomes present in the role of the priest. And when each of us are being priestly, God is present. Hopefully God is present in me when I'm doing God's will. And God's present in you as well, because we're created in God's image and we've been dressed in the person of Christ. So as we reflect on both this second reading about the role of the priests and then upon this gospel, let us renew our understanding of priesthood. It's not just something you just come to people like me and say, well, Father's holy, so we don't really need to do the rest of it. We don't really need to do anything else. One of my relatives, a bit, what would be the word to say? Maybe not arrogant, but a bit of a joker, I think is probably a better way of putting it. One of my relatives comes from an Irish background, and there was an Irish tradition that if you had a priest in the family, that the rest of the family gets to go to heaven. It's a nice idea. And one of my relatives says, oh, well, I don't need to do anything. We've got a priest in the family. We're set. And I think to a certain extent that was the Old Testament understanding. But that's not the way it is. We are all priestly. We're all called to live the way of Christ. And even with my own relatives, sometimes they don't even get that either. But that's the challenge perhaps of preaching and perhaps of trying to reflect on the scriptures and to live it out. Let's be holy. Let's be priestly people who help to enter into that sacrifice of Christ, who are mystically present as we gather around this altar at the Last Supper, at Calvary, at the resurrection, and know that we are in this sacrifice with Christ and that we're going to then live out this sacrifice through love, a love of God, a love of neighbour, and also a love of God's presence in each of ourselves. This is the first commandment. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: you must love your neighbour